It's a series of three talks on social welfare policy in the United States, an introduction and overview that will follow what we consider to be income and poverty in the United States. Second, kind of development, American political development in talking about poverty programs here in the United States. And then finally, an overview of two of the largest social welfare programs that we have in the United States, which is A, Social Security, and B, Medicare. So our first discussion is income and poverty in the United States. And we'll take a little bit of a look at measures related to how much different demographic groups in the United States make, and then what groups are more likely to be in poverty in the United States, and how we define poverty, because that's a very important term for us. So I'm going to draw a lot of data from the United States Census Bureau. They put out a regular bulletin on income and poverty in the United States. Much of this comes from the American Community Surveys, various other research that the Census Bureau does on an ongoing basis. The most recent report that's available came out in September 2019 and has data for 2018. Again, this is data that for the most part is non-contested. What we'll see is that there are some different views on what constitutes poverty and whether or not people actually are in poverty. And it's a contested idea as to measures of poverty. But overall, if you're interested, it's great data to take a look at, and government data is the best place to start on things like this. Looking at what we have in front of us, we have the median household income in the United States for 2018 across a bunch of different demographic categories. Again, thinking in terms of the median as opposed to the mean or the average, the reason why we would use the median income rather than the average income is because it has a tendency to slice off the outliers. So, for example, with the median income, we're taking a look at the person or the family that's at the very middle of the income system in the United States. And that prevents things from being skewed by having, say, for example, Warren Buffett or Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates or somebody else who's making large amounts of money, which skew the data. So the median income is a much better measure of trying to understand American incomes. So all households in the United States in 2018, the median household income was $63,179. Looking at this, there are a couple of stats that you can take a look at in more detail here. Those that include families have a much higher median income than those that don't constitute families. What we see is that there is a very large disparity when it comes to the race or ethnicity of the householders. So when we're looking at this, white non-Hispanic families have a median income of a little bit over $70,000, as opposed to African Americans who only have a median income of $41,000, or Hispanics of any race, $51,000. And the outlier that we see here are families, Asian families, have a median income of $87,000. Now, again, you'll notice here that it says white non-Hispanic. One way traditionally that the Census Bureau has tried to count Hispanics is more of an ethnicity than as a race. And basically, they'll ask the question, are you white, black, Asian? And then they'll ask if you consider yourself to be Hispanic, and that could be a white Hispanic or a black Hispanic. So the reason why this breaks it down between white, non-Hispanic, and Hispanic is just the way that the Census Bureau does data. Households that have younger people tend to have higher median incomes. People that are native born to the United States have higher median incomes. And not too surprisingly, what we find also is that it varies depending on what region of the country that you live in. So say here in the northeastern part of the United States with large metropolitan regions, what we see is that the income is higher as it is in the West Coast. And in general, the southern states have higher rates of poverty and tend to have lower incomes. And the Midwest is kind of somewhere in the middle. Now, what's also we might want to think about in terms of that is that the cost of living, while you may have a lower median income, the cost of living for living in some southern or rural areas is much less than it would be if you were living, say, for example, in northern or southern California, or New York City or other urban areas in the Northeast. So in some respects, the median income isn't necessarily commensurate to how much wealth that you have, because it might just be far more expensive to live in one region than the other. The other thing that the Census Bureau breaks this out by is metropolitan statistical area. Basically, that's just in general one big city and the surrounding areas. So in Philadelphia, that would be the major city, the principal city in the Philadelphia metropolitan statistical area. And then, at least on the Pennsylvania side, Bucks County, Montgomery County, Delaware County, and Chester County would be part of that metropolitan statistical area, as well as northern Delaware and three kind of ring counties over in New Jersey. So what we see is that if you're inside a metropolitan statistical area, in other words, if you're around a big city, your income is very much higher than if you live outside an MSA, which is essentially rural areas. And what's also interesting, if you take a look here, is that inside the cities, the income itself is much lower. Outside the principal cities around an MSA, what you'll see is the income's higher. So all you really have to think about is thinking about, lower income people being trapped inside of the city of Philadelphia, whereby a wealthier suburban areas that surround it, that's essentially telling us what happens there. Now, if we take a look at income distribution in the United States, and for right now, the only stat that we're going to take a look at is how much people actually earn. This is not saved wealth, inherited wealth, or any other kind of capital that people have. This is merely income as it comes in through the form of wages. So what we see here is that, we are very skewed in the United States. When we talk about quintiles, we're talking about 20% increments. So the highest quintile, the top 28 wealthiest people, top 20% of wealthy families in the country, essentially account for about 52% of all the income, and the top 5% overall account for 23%. And as we get down to the lowest 20%, the poorest 20% in the United States, they account for only about 3.1%. So basically, if you take a look at the bottom 60% of America and income, what you're essentially taking a look at is about 25% of the income is made by the bottom 60%, and the remainder by those in the top 40%. So now that we understand a little bit about how income is distributed in the United States, the question is, how do we define poverty? And essentially, the federal government has a threshold of defining poverty, and this is the 2018 definition of poverty. As we look at it, you are in poverty if you're under age 65 and you make $13,000 or less. As you can imagine, it'd be very difficult to get by on $13,000, particularly if you live in a wealthier area. This is not related to area of the country that you live in or cost of living indexes. This is just one kind of metric for the entire country. And as we go down here, the definitions, the more people you have in your household and whether or not they're children, it makes a difference as to how you define poverty. Now, one thing to be mindful of here, and I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a couple of minutes, is that this basically doesn't include taxes or income from government through tax credits, or any other kind of non-cash benefits that people might get from the government. And it also excludes capital gains, which you might seem to think would be a little ridiculous given the fact that most poor people in the country don't own stocks or other things that would produce capital gains. But that's probably more of a relevant for people that are older. Now, if we take a look at major social programs in the United States, we see that there are a couple that contribute very highly to people getting out of poverty. So in addition to the normal index of poverty, uh, the Census Bureau also calculates an alternative poverty measure. And this takes into account social spending by the federal government and states, as well as taxes and expenses that people have. And what we find is that Social Security is most responsible for getting people out of poverty in the United States and changing the poverty index here. Refundable tax credits come from the federal government in the form of the Earned Income Tax Credit. And many states also have some form of that, which means that if you pay taxes, you get a certain amount back. And sometimes that can actually be a refund that's larger than what you paid for taxes in that year. And then you see other common programs like food stamps, which is SNAP, SSI, which is disability income, housing subsidies, government programs to ensure that people pay child support, school lunch programs, TANF, which is what we generally consider to be welfare programs or general assistance, unemployment, LIHEAP, which is the low income heating and energy assistance program that helps people pay for energy during the winter, workers' compensation, women and infants and children, which is food support programs for women that are pregnant or have children up to the age of 5. And then what we see is that income taxes actually make people more impoverished in this government measure, as do some other expenses. I don't want to dwell on that. But the point is, these alternative measures that the Census Bureau looks at actually are because many people argue that the poverty index that we see back here, these thresholds really aren't relevant. So some people on the right say, well, we have all these other programs like Social Security that pull people out of poverty, and you don't account for that income when you talk about poverty rates. And then there are other people on the left that say, yeah, but you also don't talk about things like Social Security and payroll taxes and work expenses and medical expenses that come out of people's pockets either, which disproportionately hit the poor. So there are all these varying definitions out there that are contentious and produce different types of statistics related to poverty in the United States. But we'll use this official poverty index because that's generally what we'll be looking at. One other thing to be mindful of is that Medicaid and Medicare are not listed on here, as are the children's health insurance programs, which are fairly big subsidies to people that are poor that help them get health insurance. So let's take a look at the amount of people in poverty in the United States. So this is the overall poverty rate as constructed by the federal government from 1959 to 2018. And as you take a look at it, in absolute numbers, at the top, we saw a huge drop in the 1960s and 1970s when we started a lot of the Great Society welfare state programs under President Johnson. And one thing that you see is each one of those grayish blue lines that are vertically placed on this chart show when there's a recession. And in most of those cases, what we see is that there is almost always a rise in the amount of people in poverty during recessions. It's not too hard to understand why, because people lose their jobs, people lose health care, and they're basically either subsistent on unemployment insurance or welfare programs, but don't have a good stream of income. What the more important chart here shows is the chart on the bottom, which shows the actual poverty rate as opposed to the population in poverty. And what we see is that there has been a pretty steady decline of poverty in the United States since those Great Society programs back in the 1960s. We currently have about 11.8% of people that are in poverty in the United States, as calculated by the Census Bureau using federal government statistics. And again, you'll see that rises and falls quite a bit during recessions, which is a real tax, makes it very difficult for the federal, state, and local governments to be able to deal with programs concerning poverty. One thing that really is striking is the poverty rates by sex or gender. And generally, we find that women are more likely to be in poverty than are males. Part of that is because of the income gap between males and females. Also, women are more likely than men to have single-family households with children. So we see that in general, women tend to be more impoverished than men. But let's break this out a little bit further and see it some of the demographic groups. So here is the poverty rate related to various demographic groups. And as we see in 2018, it's 11.8% overall. Not surprisingly, again, when we think of terms of income, also you think in terms of poverty rates when it comes to race. So white non-Hispanics are more than 3.5 points lower than the average population to be in poverty. African Americans have the highest rate of poverty. About 1 in 5 African Americans is in poverty, and Hispanics at about 17%, and Asians pretty much on par with white non-Hispanics in the United States. So we mentioned females more likely to be in poverty than men. What we've seen also in other discussions this semester is that younger people are growing up in more impoverished than they have in the recent past. So if you take a look at age groups, those people under the age of 18 are more likely to be in poverty than any other age group. Those people who are born in the United States are less likely to be in poverty. People who are here in the United States as foreign-born non-citizens are much more likely to be in poverty. We also find that people in the South tend to be in more poverty than other regions of the country. People that are inside major cities and people that are in rural areas are more likely to be in poverty than people in suburban areas. And not surprisingly, people who work full-time year-round are much, much less likely to be in poverty at only 2.3% versus those people who didn't work at all during a given year as close to 30%. And if you're disabled, you're more likely to be in poverty than if you don't have a disability. And then finally, one of the most important kind of indicators of whether or not a person's going to be in poverty or not really has to do with their educational attainment. So for people that have graduated from college with a bachelor's degree or higher, only about 4.4% are in poverty. If you have no high school diploma, you're looking at about 1/4 of people without a high school diploma that are in fact people that are in poverty. So education is a big indicator of people being in poverty. Now, there are a couple of other interesting things as we take a look at poverty rates in the United States. One thing that we do find is that if you are married, you're much more likely to have a stable and higher income than you are if you happen to not be married. That's a high indicator of wealth as well as lack of poverty. So if you are in a married couple, 4.7% are in poverty versus female householder with no spouse at about 1 out of every 4 people, and about 12% for males. And as we drill down here, what we find is that, while people that are in married households, again, have this lower rate of poverty, if you do have children, even if you're in married couples, you have a slightly higher rate of poverty. But what's really astounding is when you go down and you take a look at families with a female householder and no spouse. If there are children living in your household, particularly under the age of 6, I think in terms of childcare here, almost 1/2 of all families in the United States with a female householder and children under age 6 are in poverty. So these are big indicators. Single-family households tend to be much more likely to be in poverty than do other groups. So this is just a general overview of income and how we define poverty and some stats from the Census Bureau. and we'll come back and watch more.